please. So next slide. So the title is Topology, Evolution, and Knots. So I'm going to start with this little cartoon. It's two little fish, and they're swimming along, and this old fish comes in the other direction and says, "Hi, boys, how's the water?" And as they swim along, one little fish says to the other, "What's water?" So I'm going to talk about water. Next slide, sort of. So in the beginning, there were lipids in water that were delivered by these snowball-like asteroids. We know that. And everything I'm going to say is based upon scientific evidence. It's all evidence-based. So these snowball-like asteroids struck the Earth because it had no oxygen in the atmosphere to burn them up. And so if you look on the right, we begin with at noon at 1 o'clock, number one, at 12 o'clock, the implicate order, based upon David Bohm's wholeness in the implicate order. And then the lipids, when they're immersed in water, they spontaneously form protocells or micelles. And so you form a lipid boundary between the inside of this protocell and the outside environment. Next, if you could just hit it again. And so you form what Bohm referred to as the explicate order. And he explained that as the way that our subjective senses have evolved in order to cope with the implicate order as we perceive it. It's highly subjective. And it may relate to what Nick was talking about. I'd like to think so, but be that, we can comment about that later. So next slide. So my hypothesis is that the lipid boundary becomes the cell membrane, which is a functional Mobius strip. Paper I just got accepted for publication. So it's one continuous surface with no perceived inside or outside, and I'll explain that. So I'm depicting these, lipids are amphiphiles. They have positive and negative charges on either end. And so what happens is they align in the water perpendicularly with their negative charged end in the water and their positively charged end facing upward. And as they pack, they reduce the van der Waals forces of surface tension, and they form these micelles, as I just explained earlier. And that in turn is a functional Mobius strip. It's not a literal Mobius strip, but it's a functional Mobius strip, which is the basis for evolution. So I'm not talking Darwin here. I'm talking about the cell as the basis for evolution. Next slide. And so it's experimentally known that gravity is required for the formation of these micelles. And Einstein's theory, field theory states that when gravity, if you look at the far left, I guess, can you see the cursor? Yes? So there's gravity on the far left. When it impinges on a curved surface, it generates energy, which supports the quantum entanglement of particles moving in and out of the cell. And that in turn, that local effect references the non-locality of the cosmos. And in turn, Lynn Margulis's theory of symbiogenesis kicks in here. Margulis had hypothesized that, for example, the way that the mitochondrion of cells evolved was by internalizing bacteria, and there's ample evidence that that's true. That in turn gave rise to what I have referred to as the first principles of physiology. So the factors that are internalized by the cell, which present an existential threat, then are compartmentalized within the cell by internal membranes, and they form the physiology of the cell. And that in turn gives rise to the evolutionary process as an iterative process. So next slide. I'm just going to close the door, sorry. Okay, so this slide is entitled Metaphysics of Topology. So I'm talking about surfaces. So on the left is the topology of the cell, and the surface area to volume ratio is critical for metabolism. So that's the guiding principle for the cell. And similarly, in physics, lo and behold, I discovered what's called the Schwarzschild radius. So Schwarzschild was an astronomer who superimposed Einstein's field theory on a sphere and discovered this radius, which is the principle behind understanding what black holes are. But as I show here in italics, in both cases, you're punching a hole. In the case of the cell, it's punching a hole in the implicate order, it's creating space. In the case of the black hole, it's punching a hole in space-time. So you have a continuous surface now with a space within it, which then gets filled through the processes of either the cell or the black hole. Next slide. And if you have questions, please interrupt me.
Can't do it.
Can't do it?
No, it won't move to the next slide. I've got it.
Okay. So now I'm talking about what mind is, what consciousness is. And I know that's a big leap, but I'll explain. So here at the bottom are these amphiphilic lipid molecules in water, which then, if you move upward, they allow for the quantum entanglement, the localization and non-localization of quantum mechanics. And as I said, I'm laying claim to the idea that this is a functional Mobius strip that's being formed in the evolution of the organism. But the reason that the Mobius strip idea is relevant is because the way that I've understood this process is by iteratively giving rise to emergent properties, which are actually conditional on the condition of the organism referencing previously evolved traits. And so the cell has memory. The cell membrane is actually a form of memory. And at this step between the molecules and the cell membrane, the micellar membrane, the cell remembers that it was individual molecules. So in other words, it remembers both the state of integration of those molecules and prior to that. So it's acting as a hologram, and it's acting as a Mobius strip in the sense that there is no inside or outside with this memory process. And in turn, that gives rise to what we think of as mind. It's not something in our heads or something in the environment or both. It's actually a consequence of the internalization and endogenization of factors in the environment. That's what evolution is. And as I indicate here on the far right, it's the transition from the abiotic to the biotic. Next slide.
John, could you say, so could you just say a little bit more about two things? One is this, like the idea that the cell membrane has no inside and no outside, which I don't quite get. And the other is, I mean, I would be a believer in the cell membrane acting as memory, but I don't actually know what the sort of biochemical basis for that is.
Right. Okay. So Peter, if you could just go back one slide.
Yeah.
Hopefully. Okay. So the reason, Nicola, that I'm saying that the cell actually doesn't have an inside or an outside is because it remembers when it didn't have an inside or an outside. It's referencing this previous state of individual molecules, which then spontaneously form the cell. So that's why I say it's not a literal Mobius strip in the sense that, like you take a piece of, a strip of paper, you twist it, you attach the ends, there's one continuous membrane. No, functionally, it's acting as a Mobius strip and the cell doesn't realize that it has an inside or an outside. It's actually, it's extending into the environment and inward as well. And the reason I say that is because the way that the evolutionary process works is by internalizing factors in the environment, which then create the physiology that generates this kind of phenomenology. Does that make any sense?
Well, it does, except that I don't know how my cells get together to make actual cells.
My cells?
I know what a micelle is, and I know what a cell is.
Yeah.
I mean, like cells have lots of different organelles in them, but I don't actually know how my cells come together to MICELLE, how they come together to make cells. What I mean, that sounds like quite a complicated phenomenon.
Right. Okay. So both the Moderna and the Pfizer mRNA vaccines are carried by micelles. So the way we make micelles in the laboratory is we take lipids and we put them in a test tube and we suspend them in an aqueous solution, and then we dry it down. And drying them down and resuspending them, the lipids spontaneously form these micellar structures. It's not known exactly.
That I'm fine with that. It's the micelles becoming cells. That's the process that I don't. I'm fine with. Yeah, I know about lipids and
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
yeah, I know about that, but I don't know about how my cells come together to create actual living cells.
Right. Okay. So as I said earlier, these snowball-like asteroids that struck the surface of the Earth, that we know that they brought lipids and water together
Yeah.
to form the ocean, the primordial ocean. And it's in that environment that these micellar structures were formed. And there's evidence for that. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. No, somehow I'm not communicating. I'm fine about my cells.
yeah.
It's cells. Living cells have things like mitochondria and Golgi complexes and all these, and nuclei, or well, not all cells have nuclei, but they're cells. Living cells are very complex beings, organisms, and
Right.
I don't know how my cells, MICELLES, get together and create cells. But I mean, maybe that's just
Well, the way I came up with this idea was I actually I'm a lung biologist, so I started with lung cells and I worked my way backwards, knowing what I knew about the ontogeny and phylogeny of these cells, and then I finally got to the unicellular state through that iterative process. Basically, because Conrad Bloch had discovered the cholesterol synthetic pathway, and his rationale was it took 11 atoms of oxygen to make one molecule of cholesterol, but that's reasoning after the fact. The reason that lipids were used was for this reason, for this description that I'm talking about. So I'm saying that empirically, I was able to demonstrate, reduce complex physiology to the unicellular state, almost step by step, with some jumps. So I don't know if that's satisfactory, but empirically, I was able to do that. That's how I came to this conclusion. So we can talk about it after.
Yeah. No, fine. Okay. Yeah. All
okay.
Right. Cool.
And I should say, but we start as a unicellular structure in the zygote, but that's begging the argument. I understand.
Yeah. That's not the point. That's that we're all.
Right. Got it. Okay. Next slide.
No.
Okay. So we systematically make an error in tracing our evolution from the present backwards, reasoning after the fact, which is illogical. Up until now, that's all we've had available to us to try and determine who and what we are. But since the advent of cell culture, I'm a cell culturist, in the mid-20th century, we have had the opportunity to study living cells both in isolation and in combination. The following is the application of that methodology to reveal our evolution from the beginning in the unicellular state and what it teaches us. So next slide, please. So Rutherford is famous for saying that all science is either physics or stamp collecting. But without biology, there would be no knowledge of physics. As a veteran stamp collector myself, I hope I can convince you of the relevance of understanding biology to understand physics. Everything I'm about to talk about, I've mentioned that it's all empirically based. I have reverse engineered lung evolution as a model for tracing the exapted and pre-adaptive stages from one adaptation to the next. I can't read the bottom of the slide, but so let's go on to the next slide. So I'm contrasting Darwin with Gould and Eldredge and my theory of evolution. So on the left is gradualism, that's Darwin's theory, that things just happen over time. In the middle is Gould and Eldredge's punctuated equilibrium, which maintain that there were gaps between the stages of evolution, but I maintain that that's because they just didn't have the empiric ability, the horsepower to see the intermediate steps, nor did they choose to look at them because they were more interested in the materialism than in the energy flow. And on the right is what I refer to as quantal evolution, the consequence of stress being placed on cells, in fact, rendering them able to remodel themselves. So this is, and we know that this is the case because this is what we do when we study injury repair mechanisms. It's a well-known phenomenon. And so this is how the cells are able to remodel themselves under conditions of stress internally, not from, it's not the reproductive strategy, it's cellular remodeling. Next slide. And I depict that here on the far left. I'm contrasting the phylogeny of the lung with the ontogeny. They're basically the same process at two different timescales, but the underlying cellular principles of cell-cell communication are one and the same. So in the same sense, energy equaling mass times the square of the speed of light, converting matter into energy is depicted on the right. And if you hit the advance that, so that is evolution in the sense that, Peter, can you, I think there's more to that graph on the right.
Hang on.
If you hit it once.
Oh, you went, hit it again.
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Do you want again?
I guess, yeah. So I'm showing how the same phenomenon can be seen both as a material process as opposed to a flow of energy, because that's actually what both ontogeny and phylogeny are. We focus on matter when in fact it's energy flow. And the reason I say that is because the way that these processes work is through a series of high energy phosphate exchanges, literally. Okay, next slide then. Yeah, we don't, yeah, okay. Thank you. Okay, and the origin of this is the Big Bang. So yeah, okay. So Einstein was able to come up with his wonder year of 1905 because he dreamt that he was traveling in tandem with a light beam. So the trick is to step out of what we do know and look at the box from outside. That's what I'm trying to express, is the idea that when you do that, you were able to realize the holism of either physics in the case of Einstein, or in this case, the holism of biology. Next slide. So homologies are things that have derived from the same origin. And I'm saying that the atom and the cell are homologs. And the reason so next, if you hit the button. So homeostasis of the atom and the cell are held in common. They both rely upon homeostatic processes. Again, advanced it. So in the case of the Pauli exclusion principle, it's homologous with the first principles of physiology. Hit it again, please. Advance it. So, I'm sorry. So for the Pauli exclusion principle, there are 4 determinants of electron spin. No 2 electrons can have the same spin in an atom. The first 3 principles in the Pauli exclusion principle are deterministic. The 4th is time-based and probabilistic. In the case of the first principles of physiology, there's negative entropy, Schrodinger's concept of life. There is the energy source and homeostasis. So both negative entropy and the bioenergetics are determined, whereas homeostasis is probabilistic. So there's where that homology between the atom and the cell come from, in my opinion. And then there's also a non-localization, a principle of quantum mechanics, which is the same as what happens in biology. It's referred to as pleiotropy. So for example, you have crystalline protein in the lens of your eye, and there's also crystalline protein in your liver. They do different things, and they've evolved at different stages of this process of evolution. But that's a form of non-localization, in my opinion. Next slide. And coherence and physiology, for example, you have wave collapse in quantum mechanics. And in physiology, you have a similar process whereby under stress, cellular pathways do actually collapse, and they elicit a stronger response. And there are many examples of that. So there is this homology between coherence and physiology as well. Next. And I just mentioned, so for example, wave collapse and Maslow's peak experiences are one and the same process. In my reduction of what's going on in physiology and evolution. Next. And Heisenberg uncertainty principle and ambiguity are the basis for the origin of life. So I use the term ambiguity for the origin of life in the micelle, because you have negative entropy within the cell and positive entropy outside of the cell. So that's an ambiguous state. And that's much like Heisenberg in the sense that the ambiguity is problematic in terms of the physics, but in terms of biology, it's what drives biology. Next slide. So homeostasis as applied to the atom and the cell. So Harold Moravitz has stated that, so if you think about a hydrogen atom, the simplest atom, there's a proton and an electron, and they're in homeostatic balance with one another. And similarly, you see in the cell, as I said just in the previous slide, the negative entropy and the homeostatic and the chemiosmosis, the bioenergetics, are regulated by homeostasis. And this is where the first principles of physiology come in. Next slide. Oh, and the origin of both is the Big Bang. And I know that Peter takes exception, Rollins takes exception to that, but that's all I got. So next slide. So Pauli's exclusion principle versus the first principles of physiology. Again, I'm contrasting the two and comparing them as well. And what I'm saying is that, again, that the first principle, and I'm repeating myself, I'll just skip it. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so in terms of, I'm trying to depict this idea of the non-local and the local within the cosmos, and that's very similar to this pleiotropic process in the human, in physiology. You see the same phenomenon, and it is emulating what is occurring in the cosmologically because of this process of endogenization of factors in the environment. So the physiology is mimicking what happens in cosmology. Next slide. The concept of coherence and comparing that with physiology. So cell physiology is mediated by cell communications, which are mediated in turn by soluble growth factors and receptors. I spent 50 years studying this stuff, and it was actually discovered in my lab when I was a grad student. And the coordination of the cellular physiology is mediated by coherent calcium waves. So it's the flow of calcium, whether it's a neuron or any other cell. The neuron is a professional calcium flux mediator, but all cells behave through calcium waves. Next slide. So wave collapse, in terms of Maslow peak experiences, those peak experiences are moments of extraordinary experience such as love, understanding, happiness, or rapture, during which a person feels more whole, alive, self-sufficient, and yet a part of the world, more aware of truth, justice, harmony, and goodness. I think I took that from Maslow himself. Neuroendocrine hormones like endorphins and oxytocin integrate calcium flow. So these are hormones, neuroendocrine hormones produced by the posterior pituitary in the brain. And they produce, for example, the proverbial runner's high, which many people experience when they do long distance running or childbirth for that matter. And the effect of the hormones is to cause a wave collapse, as I said earlier, maximizing their effect on integrated physiology. That is what integrated physiology actually means. Next slide. So Heisenberg versus biological ambiguity. Heisenberg uncertainty states that the position and momentum of a particle cannot be determined simultaneously. And this ambiguity is, that kind of ambiguity is mirrored in the ambiguity of life, beginning in a state of negative entropy with respect to the entropy of the surrounding environment. Next slide. So I'm just illustrating that here. I'm superimposing phylogeny, the history of the organism, on ontogeny as two harmonic wave functions. And when you do that, you achieve wave collapse, and that actually is what evolution constitutes. So by reducing phylogeny and ontogeny to their cellular principles of cell-cell communication, I can do this trick, and it reveals the fact that evolution is exactly that. It's the superposition of phylogeny and ontogeny, and to the far left is quantum mechanics. So if you hit the, yeah. So it's been difficult to infer quantum mechanics in physiology because the physiology is seen as Newtonian, and how do you interface that with these very small events of quantum mechanics? But the cellular communication achieves that. That's how that is done. And so there is quantum mechanics at the basis of physiology. Next slide. And so, as I said earlier, evolution is a process of self-engineering. It's constituted by cellular homeostasis. And then when you impose stress on the system becomes dishomeostatic. It generates what are called radical oxygen species from oxygen itself. And those radical oxygen species are known to cause gene mutations and, more importantly, gene duplications. And that's what generates evolution. So, for example, the duplications that occurred during the transition from water to land about 500 million years ago were mediated by these very same steps. Next slide. And so I'm illustrating that here, top to bottom, lung, heart, kidney. And I'm showing from left to right how these different ultimately complicated physiologies evolved from much simpler structures. So for example, the swim bladder of a fish gave rise to the mammalian lung. The heart started as a muscularization of the vasculature, and then over time it became more and more complicated until you had a 4-chambered heart. And in the intermediates, in a frog, you have a 3-chambered, and in a reptile, similarly a 3-chambered heart, and then a 4-chambered heart in mammals. The kidney, for example, which is homologous with the alveoli of the lung, does something of a similar nature by making the vasculature of the glomus of the fish kidney much more complicated and convoluted, literally, in order to maintain water and salt balance. Next slide. So a thermodynamic narrative would go as follows. So next slide. You have the Big Bang 13.7 billion years ago, beginning theoretically with a singularity of some sort, and then that generated a vector, a force vector at 0. And next slide. So there's evidence that in fact these frozen snowball asteroids actually did strike the Earth. And this is where the lipids for the micelles derive from. I'm showing an example of this. And so there is literally hard evidence for this. Next slide. And again, so I'm reiterating what I was saying earlier, that you have these amphiphils that are at the cell surface of the water in the primitive Earth, with charges negative and positive, causing this perpendicular configuration of these lipid molecules. And because these structures are kind of like antennae, things like photons and electromagnetic force, in all probability, have caused the formation of these micelles. Because the amphiphils, as they pack in the water surface, they reduce the surface tension of water, the van der Waals forces that cause surface tension. And that allows, in combination with these energetic forces, the formation of these micelles, and in turn, the formation of the cell. And so on the far right, I'm saying that the entropy of lipids decreases the entropy of water, and that in turn gives opportunity for negative entropy. Schrodinger's idea of life in his book, What is Life, published in 1944. Next slide. So as contrasted with the conventional way of thinking about memory, I think that memory actually was a product of these micelles, because if you imagine that these micelles were floating near or at the surface of the water in the primordium, the sun would warm them up and these lipids would deform, because that's what lipids do. They liquefy when they're warmed. And then at night, without sun, in the cold, they reform. They have memory, they have molecular memory. And in the process of doing that iteratively over and over again, they calcium, and then they accumulated a greater and greater degree. A subset of these organisms or proto-organisms which evolved calcium channels. Those are our forebears. That's where calcium, the regulation of calcium movement evolved from. Again, this is not the conventional way of thinking of memory, as you might expect. But I do think that there is evidence to support this idea as an alternative to the conventional way we think of memory as something that's housed in our brains. It's actually a distributed process throughout our body. Next slide. And here I'm depicting Margulis's endogenization process as you go from a simple cell, and then it accretes materials within it, going from X to Y to Z, and ultimately at the other end, at the right-hand side, you have a more complicated unicell that gives rise to more complicated multicellular organisms. Next slide. So embryologically, we start with a zygote, a fertilized egg. And as I said earlier, the energy flow from the zygote to each step of embryology is characterized by these high energy phosphates. I'm showing cyclic adenosine phosphate, cyclic ANP, as one category, and inositol phosphates as the other. But the reality is that this is actually a flow of energy, not a change in the material state. I mean, that is in fact the case, but that's an epiphenomenon. It's actually, the purpose is to transfer energy from one cellular state to another, from one life cycle to the next. Next slide. And so here what we see the classic embryology, and I'm just underscoring the idea that we focus on these very interesting and elaborate structures, but in fact, those are a diversion. It's energy that's flowing, not material change that is really critically important. Next slide. And so I'm extrapolating from that to the idea that the unicell was actually what's called a niche construction. So niche construction is depicted in the bottom there, the way that beavers build dams and how that changes the topography of the land, or how humans build homes and towns and villages and cities and states and nation states until you get to Gaia. It's the same idea. So in reality, the integration of the cell with its environment is a function of this ability to internalize factors in the environment. And it's actually what Balmer described as enfolding and unfolding. Next slide. And Simon Conway Morris is wont to say that first there were bacteria, now there is New York. It's very clever, but how does that happen? I try to explain that in the way that I just did in the previous slide. I think he's right, but it's more difficult to explain it as in a mechanistically valid way than to just, yeah, sure, it's cute, but it doesn't really tell you much. Next slide. So there is a continuum from physiology to cosmology as consciousness, and I alluded to that earlier, but I was saying that, again, I'm reiterating the fact that, so the internalization of the environment causes biology to emulate or to be constituted by the same laws of nature as the cosmos, and it therefore has to comply with those. And as a result, what we think of as consciousness and mind is actually the way that we intuit the cosmologic laws of nature. That's actually what I think consciousness is. Next slide. I studied this molecule, parathyroid hormone-related protein. It's shown in the upper left there. It's expressed in lung and bone cells for many years under NIH funding. And it's an interesting molecule because when you stretch a lung or a bone cell, it increases the mRNA for that molecule, PTHRP. If you put it into microgravity, that gene shuts off. That probably refers back to the amphiphilic construct that I referred to earlier. And the fact, so we know, for example, that liposomes, my cells, cannot form in microgravity. And so in a similar experiment to the one I did with lung and bone cells was done with yeast by another group. In that case, they showed that the yeast cannot polarize, so it cannot conduct a calcium flux, and it can't reproduce. So basically, they're zombies. So these data support the idea that in order to evolve from these amphiphilic molecules to my cells and to cells requires gravity. Gravity is necessary for life. Next slide. Hameroff and Penrose, Roger Penrose, the cosmologist, Hameroff, the anesthesiologist, came up with the OR theory of consciousness. They focused on microtubules, and but all neurons, central and peripheral, have microtubules. And physiologic evolution is based on endosymbiosis, cell-cell communication, and that provides a holistic network for consciousness. The endogenous, and all these cells have microtubules universally. So the endogenization of factors in the environment aligns our internal environment with the external environment, providing a common basis for consciousness and cosmic consciousness. The skin was the pre-adaptive origin of the central nervous system. We know that for a fact. Next slide. So in terms of a vertical integration of physiology, if we start at the bottom with these amphiphiles, and then next, if you hit the, yeah, so we go to first principles of physiology, and next we see physiologic stress of the water-land transition that occurred 500 million years ago. Next, adrenaline as a response to stress had an integrative effect on the evolution of the lung, which is shown on the right. Next, and that promoted oxygenation, metabolism, and warm-bloodedness, endothermy. So here you have, under the aegis of stress, you have the evolution of land adapted warm-blooded organisms. That's how, at least my reduction of that process had transpired. Next slide, please. And that's just showing the integration of all those things. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. And then bipedalism was instrumental in the evolution of consciousness because it freed the forelimbs for tool making and language. And language actually is another tool making process. And I won't go through the details of that, but they are one and the same. They're both housed in what's called the area of Broca in the cerebrum. Yeah, so bipedalism was critical for the evolution of human consciousness as a result of standing on two legs. Next slide. I'll show human consciousness. Okay. So I've actually learned from Peter a great deal. And I think that Peter's, with all due respect, Peter, I think that the rewrite system has two characteristics which are very much the same as what I have described for evolution. One is the fact that the unicell, like the attractor in the rewrite system, is also an attractor. It's seen as zero because it is operating under negative entropy. And the other characteristic that's critically important is that my understanding is that in the rewrite system, when you introduce a new datum point in the data set, the system has to consider that and then either include or exclude that datum. And the same thing happens in evolution, particularly in epigenetic research, like the work that's done in my lab at UCLA. So I think that the rewrite system is actually a mathematical expression of cellular molecular evolution. Next slide. So life as a lipid boundary establishes the explicate order. So before there was life, there was only the implicate order. And I'm showing that here as a continuum from the Big Bang. And the fact that, so I think there are arrows here, Peter, if you just click it. Yeah, so we're going from the implicate order to the explicate order as a consequence of that lipid boundary between the outside of the cell and the inside of the cell. So next slide. So energy becomes matter. So Newton's third law of motion, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. I think that represents with all due respect to Nick, the equal sign in physics, E equals mc squared. In chemistry, you have sodium plus chloride equals sodium chloride. In biology, it's endoderm plus mesoderm plus ectoderm equals offspring. So without the back pressure, without the reaction to the Big Bang of homeostasis, we would have no matter, it would all be energy. So this is where the material aspect of life evolved from, for physics, chemistry, and biology alike. Next slide. And here I'm showing it as a vertical integration, starting again from those ANPA files at the bottom, and then the first principles of physiology, et cetera, until you get complicated physiology. And as I said earlier, near-death experiences, peak experiences, meditation, all act in a way where you actually devolve in your conscious state from from brain, central nervous system to the gut brain to the skin brain. That's how the central nervous system evolved. And you've devolved all the way back to the first principles of physiology. So I don't know if that helps, Nicole, in explaining this idea of how cells evolve, but that's how I've reduced it. So next slide. And here's a little more complicated way of looking at it, but again, it's the same flow from unicell to the multicellular organism to warm-bloodedness and bipedalism, forelimbs being freed, leading to tool-making, oral communication, written communication, and then written communication giving rise to civilization and culture. And then if you hit this button again, that's referring back to the formation of complex organisms. And if you hit it again, Peter, yeah, you get this reverberation of this process iteratively going over and over again, generating social systems as largely through the cellular evolution and niche construction. So next slide. So consciousness, individual versus cosmic consciousness. So in the beginning, you had gravity and electromagnetic force and photons impinging on these antennae-like amphiphiles generating what was the basis for consciousness. I've mentioned this before, I'm just reiterating that. So next slide. So again, if you look at this as a vertical progression, if you hit the button, Peter, again, stress is causing this vertical integration of cellular evolution. Next. And it's feeding back and going back to its emergent properties iteratively. Next. Progressively. Okay, so that's where the consciousness evolves from and devolves to. Next slide. And I'm referring back to these amphiphiles again. So there is one continuous process. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, and then it goes in both directions. So you have both the deconvolution and then the integration there, and that's how the individual cellular cell cycles interlink with one another evolutionarily. Next slide. Okay, and so I'm talking here about awareness and consciousness, and we know now that epigenetics is a very large part of evolution. It's just beginning to emerge, but the direct interaction of the organism with its environment is critically important, and that gives rise to physiologic evolution and the rise in consciousness. Next slide. And here I'm showing Peter's rewrite system on the left and Lou's knot theory mathematics on the right. And I'm saying that these mathematical constructs actually are reflections of the embryologic developmental process. And I'll explain that in a moment. So the next slide. So I'm saying that I explain the relationship of the rewrite system with evolution as I see it. Next slide. And in terms of knot theory, as I said earlier, when a cell develops, it's actually knotting itself in a sense, because you have an energy being instilled in the system and it forms these complex structures. But ultimately, it has to be able to untie itself during meiosis in the reversion to the germ cells. So that capacity to unknot is virtually, if not literally, the same as knot theory, at least in my understanding. Okay, so next slide. And so, as I said, the instilling of energy is one and the same in the unicell, and the knotting process is in the life cycle, and is one and the same with how black holes form. And I'll explain that in a minute. But I'm suggesting that the singularity is the equivalent of the cell over zero, and that's infinite. So that's where this concept of cosmic consciousness would come in. Next slide. So I'm saying that it takes a hologram to understand, to know a hologram. So if you start at the very top with that image of the amphiphiles and the gravitational force, and then you move to the right, the formation of the cell membrane as forming perhaps a pseudo Mobius strip, a functional Mobius strip, that underlies physiology and is a hologram. And then that refers back to the black hole idea, because Bekenstein had shown, interestingly, that when he tried to calculate the entropy of a black hole, it was not related to the volume of the black hole, it's related to the area of the black hole. So what he talks about is the entropic horizon. It's how the black hole expresses itself, if you will, entropically. And so in order for us to understand the cosmos, the black holes and cosmology in general, we in turn have to also be a hologram in order to be able to recognize that process. So this actually, the black hole may be the singularity, or a black hole, or the black holes of the cosmos. Next slide. So in conclusion, the evolution is serial pre-adaptations originated in lipid cell membrane, referencing lipid molecules in water before there was an inside or an outside. And pre-adaptations reference lipid molecules in the implicate order before there was an inside or outside. And that's the basis for mind. And black holes in the life cycle are recursive forms of energy, mathematically modeled by knots and the rewrite system. And I think that's the last slide. There's just a thank you. Next. Yeah, okay. So thank you. How am I doing for time? Okay. So
thank you for that, John. And I think we can I need to stop sharing screen so we can all see each other. Okay. Have we got a question to begin with?
I'd like to ask a question. Would you say that you said at the beginning that there was that the basis for the lipids and the black hole is a hole in space and time?
Yes.
And so that's a kind of fundamental assumption of your theory, that it's
Right.
from this hole that this sort of Mobius strip defines itself, where it integrates something more than is present in that layer or system from which it comes. And so would you see that it's that whole that is not in physics, it's not in something that can progress causally, that allows for this process of continually transforming into new orders of itself?
Yes, I think it's the source of creativity. Whether it's physics or biology, it's a space that needs to be filled. It's a void. Yeah, like that.
Yeah.
So that may sound like more like poetry than science, but
No, but I think it's a vital point that that the space becomes creative when you allow that hole, that void,
right.
Because
Yeah.
then it has to extend beyond itself to realize itself in a new way.
Yes.
And so immediately you include the void as something real and potential. Yeah, then you have that possibility.
Right.
And so the lipid is kind of making use of that kind of jump from nothing to something.
Correct. Yes. Yes. Like that.
Yeah. Thanks. Anyway, that was very clear.
Good.
John, I have a question which goes back to the very first image. As you know, the current theory of life on planet Earth is that all things, plants, animals, fungi, and everything, come from the same original source. Let's say that's the Gaia cell origin, and you explained how that got started, but the as it were, the energy or some physical components called chemicals came in from another place. Would you then, given that, say that life on other planets would be different, or would it be very similar to life on Earth in that sense?
I think the fundamentals would have to be the same. I think the idea of negative entropy, it has to be in place. How that plays out in terms of how that space is filled is a function of the gravitational force of the whatever structure it's sitting on, and all of the other forces in the cosmos and how they impinge. So, Gould always asked whether if you ran the tape again, would you get the same result? You wouldn't, because the conditions changed. The initial conditions are the same, but the subsequent conditions have changed. And so you get a different form, but the same principles are involved. Yes.
Okay, thanks.
I think.
No microphone. One moment.
Okay, hi. Yeah,
And then James.
jumping in, James, without the hand because the hands weren't working. So yeah, John, you have one slide where you were talking about awareness versus consciousness. Could you? I wasn't quite clear. I mean, the relationship between awareness and consciousness are very important to me. So, but I would be interested to hear a bit more about how you see them.
I think they're one and the same. I think they're just a function of how we look at it or the process by which we go through it, but I think it's one and the same thing. Yeah, in the sense that it derives from that connection between us and the cosmos. The idea that we're really just a function of cosmology. So yeah, so I don't parse it. I mean, I see it no differently. It's just a matter of how you, in what way you choose to think of it, mind or consciousness or awareness. Yeah, so it's like Andy Clark's extended mind. It's the same thing. Or Chalmers atavistic. He's talking about an atavism of what I'm talking about. So those guys were talking about what I talk about, just not with the biologic underpinnings of what I talk about.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know those chaps. So
I see. Okay, I'm sorry.
but yeah, no, not to worry. I mean, other people maybe do. So, but yeah, no, I mean, I will be talking about a distinction between awareness and consciousness in my talk. So, but I needn't go into that now. But it relates a bit to something that came up yesterday.
Awareness is probably more tethered to the physiology of, again, you know, it's like what's, you know, what is it like to be a bat? You know, they're different physiologies, but ultimately it reduces to the same process. I guess that's how I would answer it. Yeah. So yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. I think that's the distinction for me anyway.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. So I mean, for me, it's awareness is to do with a more open. Awareness is more open. Consciousness is a coming. I mean, it's again, it's in the words, you know, skira is to know. So it's kind of with knowing. So it's coming into that more articulated knowledge, basically. But we start from awareness. So babies come in with huge awareness, but their consciousness, they're developing consciousness. And the way that I see it is that basically what we do is to narrow that consciousness much too quickly into a certain kind of form, which is why I was talking about by the time we're grown-ups, we've got so many assumptions. Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's because we make up all these, you know, stories to cope with the ambiguity.
We're fed a whole load of stories.
Well, yeah, sure.
In order to function in society. I mean, this is, you know, the big problem of society now is that a lot of the stories that people have been told are negative in terms of self-esteem, and so if people can't function, particularly sort of lack of belief in spirituality, so lack of belief, you know, people believing that they're just kind of like random molecules. So if they, you know, if they can't succeed in this society, then they kind of think, well, you know, who am I, and all that kind of stuff. And so yeah, we're fed loads and loads of stories. But I mean, those are kind of obviously psychological stories. But we're you know, I mean, yeah, the Big Bang is fact as far as most people are concerned, because that's how it's always, you know, portrayed. That any questioning, any idea that, yeah, well, basically we live in a scientistic society. We do not live in a scientific society. It's been forgotten that science is a question, you know, is to do with questioning. Yeah, and you look at evidence and you question. But you know, people are brought up to think, oh, science. You actually say, science says. I mean, that is such an unscientific. You know, I mean, you know, all scientists probably, you know, just want to curl away any type of science says. Anyway, okay, that's all.
Okay, thank you, James. Your microphone.
Yeah, you can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Had I heard this talk before I had to, you know, teach biophysics, I would have, you know, almost been turned off by certain of the language. But actually, when I teach biophysics, a lot of your concepts that you're using, I actually teach in them. One problem is the negative entropy. That would have turned me off immediately, because the third law of thermodynamics says that at absolute zero, you reach minimum entropy, which is zero. So I would have immediately had problems with that. Okay. However, information, it turns out, is like anti-entropy. You define it in terms of maximum entropy minus entropy. It's exactly what you're talking about, except it's positive. So in other words, life consumes order and energy flows are what are controlled by life. In fact, if we consume energy, we would get fatter, and if we lost energy, we would get thinner. But indeed, life is consuming order, and that's what you're calling negative entropy. So I would just suggest that information is anti-entropy, if you want to think of it that way. But yes, order is anti-entropy. And so, you know, negative entropy would be a turnoff to a lot of people who know thermodynamics. I'm just saying as far as physicists, but the concepts are quite intriguing. And I would agree with a lot of what, with very much of what you're saying. As far as, you know, if you kind of take some of the language into account.
Okay.
That's just a suggestion. I have other suggestions, but you know, I can talk with you afterwards about that. But no, I actually surprisingly have learned enough about biology. I was ignorant of biology to agree with a lot of what you say, and even some of the biological processes that happen in genomics that cause epigenetics. Enzymes will crawl along and find these palindromic sequences. They're mirrors of each other. And then without any energy, without any ATP, they'll clamp. So it doesn't take any energy. By clamping, they squeeze out all of the water and form a quantum coherent state. And that quantum coherent state allows it to simultaneously space-like coherent, cut at the same time. If it wasn't for the quantum coherence, it would cut only one side, not the other, and that would prevent the epigenetic factor being produced. So, and of course, lots of people have probably heard that the birds use entanglement in their eyeballs that are set up by photons in order to navigate and detect the weak Earth's magnetic field. So I'm supportive of the way that you're thinking. I just would suggest, of course, you wouldn't know the physics language, but I'm just trying to let you know that probably what you're wanting to call negative entropy, you're wanting to think about as order or information or something like that. That's just a comment. I'm actually being positively critical.
I understand. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, coming up to 5 past. So any further questions? Or
Michael?
comments?
Yeah. John, in the big picture, you've covered an enormous amount of ground in scale and various disciplines and so on. Are you working alone? Are you part of a mysterious network of Jasons or something? How is this work going to go forward into the public domain?
So I've published about 100 papers on this subject, and I'm writing 2 additional books to the 6 I've already published. I do have a regular Zoom meeting with people at the University of Liverpool who we brainstorm. And yeah, so in terms of an entourage, that's pretty much it. That and people who read, you know, the stuff I've published. So no, other than that, no. I actually have just gotten an adjunct position at a university in Philadelphia, and I'm going to start teaching formally to students. But yeah, it's like that, step by step. But thanks for asking, Mike.
Good luck.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, any further questions or comments? Okay. Well, thank you very much for that, John. That's plenty for us to think about.
Thank you.
So Lou is going to give the final talk.